My name is Alara Vaughn. I am 30 years old. On our 6th anniversary, my husband looked at me and announced he was leaving me because he had fallen in love with a richer woman. Everyone in the room expected tears to break down, maybe even a fight. Instead, I simply replied, "Good decision." 2 weeks later, he turned pale when he discovered who that rich woman really was. Before I tell you what actually happened, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this prove that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who surprise us the most. For most people, our marriage looked perfect. We had been married for 6 years, and from the outside, everything about our life seemed stable and happy. I was known as a successful businesswoman, and over the years I had built a company that grew much faster than I ever expected. The work was hard, the pressure was constant, but it was also something I was proud of. My husband always seemed proud too. Whenever we went to family gatherings, he loved telling people about my achievements. He would say things like, "She built all of this from nothing," or "I'm lucky to have such a smart wife." Sometimes he would even joke that he was the luckiest man in the room. And honestly, I believed him. But about 3 months before our anniversary, things started to change. Not in our relationship, in my business. The market had become unpredictable. A few projects that we expected to succeed suddenly failed, some contracts were delayed, and a couple of investors became nervous. Nothing was completely falling apart, but the company was definitely going through a rough time. For the first time in years, I felt real pressure. I had built my reputation on stability and success, so seeing things become uncertain was stressful. Some nights, I barely slept, trying to solve problems that didn't seem to have easy answers. But during those difficult weeks, my husband seemed more supportive than ever. He would sit beside me when I worked late and bring me coffee. Sometimes he would tell me not to worry so much. "We'll get through this," he would say. He kept reminding me that businesses always have ups and downs. "You've built something incredible," he told me one night while I was staring at my laptop. "One bad period doesn't erase everything you've done." Hearing that from him made things easier. At least that's what I thought at the time. Then our 6th anniversary arrived. We decided to celebrate with a dinner at a nice restaurant. Nothing too extravagant, but we invited both sides of the family, my parents, his parents, a few cousins, and some close relatives who had always supported us. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed. People were laughing, sharing stories, and congratulating us for reaching another year of marriage. A few relatives even made jokes about how fast time had passed. Someone raised a glass and said, "6 years already. You two make it look easy." My husband smiled at that. For most of the evening, everything felt normal. We ate, talked, and listened to the usual family conversations. No one noticed anything strange about his behavior. If anything, he looked calm, maybe even confident. Then, near the end of the dinner, he suddenly stood up. At first, everyone thought he was about to make a romantic anniversary speech. My mother even smiled and whispered, "Here comes the love speech." But the expression on his face didn't match the moment. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked serious. The entire table slowly became quiet. He looked around the room, then finally turned his eyes toward me. "I think everyone here deserves to hear the truth," he said. I remember feeling confused. The room became completely silent. Then he said the words that changed everything. "I can't continue this marriage." At first, nobody reacted. It was as if the words didn't register. Then a few people started whispering. He continued speaking, his voice calm and steady. "Over the past few months, things have changed. Her business is no longer stable. The future is uncertain." My chest tightened, but I stayed quiet. He looked at everyone around the table. "I have dreams too," he continued. "I want a secure future. I can't destroy my life by staying in a situation that's falling apart." A few relatives looked shocked. Someone even said, "What are you talking about?" Then he finally said the part that made the entire room freeze. "I've met someone else," he announced, "someone richer, someone who understands ambition, and someone who can offer the kind of future he wants." For a moment, everyone stared at me. They were waiting for tears, for anger, for a scene. But instead, I calmly picked up my glass, took a small sip of water, and looked at him. "If that's your decision," I said quietly, "then it's probably the right one." People around the table looked completely confused. What they didn't know was that 2 weeks later, we would all meet again. Not for a celebration, but for a divorce. And that would be the day everything changed. The meeting was held in a quiet conference room inside a law office. It was strange seeing the same faces from our anniversary dinner sitting around another table, but this time there were no candles, no laughter, and no music, just silence. My parents were there, his parents were there, and a few relatives had also come, mostly out of curiosity. Divorce in our family was rare, and everyone seemed to feel like they were witnessing something important. My husband arrived a few minutes late, and the moment he walked in, it was clear something about him had changed. 2 weeks earlier, he had looked calm and serious. Now he looked confident, almost proud. He greeted a few relatives, shook hands with one of the lawyers, and then sat down like someone who had already made peace with his decision. He barely looked at me, but that didn't surprise me anymore. Over the past 2 weeks, he had become colder than I had ever seen him. Messages between us were short and formal, and most conversations were handled through lawyers. The man who used to sit beside me during late nights at work now spoke to me like I was a stranger. But the strangest part wasn't his coldness. It was the confidence. It was as if he believed he had already won something. For a while, everyone just waited as the lawyers prepared the documents. Then suddenly, he cleared his throat and said, "I'd like to say something before we begin." The room grew quiet again. His mother looked slightly nervous, but he seemed completely relaxed. "In the past 2 weeks," he continued, "a lot of people have asked me why I made the decision I did." He paused and looked around the room. "I want everyone here to understand that this was not an easy choice." Some relatives nodded slowly, but then he added something that made the atmosphere change. "However," he said calmly, "sometimes you have to make decisions that protect your future." His eyes moved briefly toward me. For the last few months, it became clear that things were no longer stable. Her business is struggling, and the future is uncertain. I noticed my father shift uncomfortably in his seat, but my husband kept talking. "I've spent years building my own plans and dreams," he said. I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Then he leaned back slightly. "And fortunately," he added, "life has a way of opening new doors." At that moment, he looked toward the door behind him, and that's when she walked in. The room immediately filled with whispers. She looked elegant and confident, dressed in a way that clearly showed she was successful. Even people who had never seen her before could tell she carried herself like someone used to wealth and power. My husband stood up quickly, and his smile returned for the first time since he entered the room. "I'd like everyone to meet someone," he said proudly. She walked to his side, and he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is the woman I was talking about." A few relatives exchanged surprised looks. He continued speaking, clearly enjoying the attention. "She's built a business empire of her own, someone who understands ambition and success." Then he looked directly at me. "Someone who knows how to keep things stable." The message was clear. The comparison didn't need to be said out loud. Some people in the room looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. But my husband seemed completely confident. He kept explaining how they had met recently, how impressed he was by her achievements, and how he believed their futures were more aligned. At one point, he even laughed lightly and said, "Sometimes life pushes you toward better choices." The woman beside him didn't say much. She mostly just stood quietly, occasionally smiling politely at the people around the table. But I noticed something interesting. Every now and then, her eyes would briefly glance toward me, and each time there was the smallest hint of a smile. The lawyers eventually placed the divorce documents on the table. "This is the final agreement," one of them said. "If both parties sign, the divorce will be officially processed." My husband picked up the pen without hesitation. It was obvious he had been waiting for this moment. But just as he was about to sign, something unexpected happened. The woman beside him suddenly lifted her hand. "Wait," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to stop everyone in the room. My husband looked surprised. "What is it?" he asked. She looked around the room slowly, making eye contact with several people. Then she said something that made everyone pause. "Before this divorce happens," she said calmly, "I think everyone here deserves to hear something." The room became silent again. My husband frowned slightly, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. She didn't answer him right away. Instead, she turned and looked directly at me. And then she smiled. That was the moment I knew the next few minutes were going to change everything. The room had gone completely silent, and my husband looked confused as he glanced between the woman beside him and the rest of the people sitting around the table. He asked her what she meant, but she didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she slowly stepped forward, placed her hand on the table, and looked around the room before speaking. "I think everyone here deserves to know the full story," she said calmly. My husband let out a small laugh, clearly trying to keep the situation under control. He said there was nothing complicated about the situation, that the divorce papers were ready and everyone should just finish the process. But she ignored him. Her eyes briefly moved toward me, and I simply nodded. That was the signal. She took a slow breath and began speaking, explaining that the truth was she was not actually the incredibly rich woman everyone in the room believed she was. Immediately, confused looks spread across the table. My husband frowned and asked what she was talking about, but she continued speaking, calmly explaining that the wealth, the business empire, and the story everyone had heard over the past 2 weeks were not exactly the truth. Now, people were whispering around the table. My husband looked annoyed and said this wasn't funny, asking again what she was trying to say. She finally turned fully toward him and said the sentence that made his entire expression freeze. "I'm not here because I'm your future," she said. "I'm here because I'm Alara's best friend." For a moment, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. My husband blinked in confusion and quietly asked what she meant. He looked at her, then looked at me, and his face slowly began to change as the meaning started to sink in. He shook his head and said it wasn't possible, but she calmly continued speaking. "3 months ago," my friend explained, "when Alara's business started showing some unstable moments, I began noticing something strange about Alara's husband." My friend folded her arms and looked straight at him as she continued. "At first, Alara's husband was very supportive, but the moment things started looking uncertain, his attitude slowly began to change." My husband quickly tried to interrupt, but my friend raised a hand and calmly told him to let her finish. Then my friend turned slightly toward everyone sitting in the room and continued explaining that Alara and she had decided to do something simple. A test. Now the entire room was listening carefully. Alara told her husband that her business might collapse, my friend continued, but the truth is the company was never actually in danger. A few relatives gasped quietly as she explained that the instability had only been temporary and that Alara's company was already recovering. By that point, my husband's face had turned pale. "But Alara and I wanted to see something," my friend added as she looked directly at him. She paused for a moment before finishing her thought. "Alara and I wanted to know the truth. Did he truly love Alara, or did Alara's husband only love the life Alara's money gave him?" The silence in the room felt heavy as those words settled in. My husband tried to respond, but no words came out. My friend calmly continued speaking, explaining that she had played the role of the wealthy woman just to see how quickly he would move on. She even sighed softly and admitted that she hadn't expected him to prove the answer so quickly. Several people around the table shook their heads in disbelief. My husband looked at me now, panic slowly growing in his eyes. He said the situation wasn't fair and accused us of setting him up, but I finally spoke for the first time since the conversation had begun and calmly told him that we hadn't set him up at all. We had simply given him a choice. Now, he looked desperate. He tried to explain that I didn't understand, that he had been confused and under stress, and that he hadn't meant things the way they sounded. But the confidence he had earlier was completely gone. The man who had proudly introduced his richer woman 2 weeks earlier now looked like someone who had just realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. My friend stepped back and crossed her arms, quietly saying that now everyone in the room knew the truth. One of the lawyers awkwardly cleared his throat, clearly unsure how to handle what had just happened. My husband slowly lowered the pen he had been holding and looked at me again. His voice had become soft as he said we could still fix things and that we didn't have to go through with the divorce. For a moment, the entire room waited for my response. I calmly reached forward, pulled the documents toward me, and picked up the pen. I told him he was right about one thing. He looked hopeful. We don't have to go through with the divorce you planned, I continued. Then I signed my name. But we are going through with the divorce I'm filing. His face went completely pale. I placed the pen back on the table and looked directly at him, explaining calmly that he hadn't lost the marriage because my business had been struggling. He had lost it because the moment he believed the money might disappear, his loyalty disappeared with it. The room remained silent as everyone absorbed the meaning of those words. Then I stood up. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself a small smile because the man who once believed he was walking away from a failing future had just realized something far worse. He hadn't escaped a collapsing life. He had walked away from the best one he would ever have.